Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that amazing performance. So I have to get myself on a new headspace now to be able to really shift gear to this presentation. But that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Big thanks to Ben and the team here as well. I'm delighted to be here, so thank you so much. So I'll be talking about instrument design in improvised live electronics. So the discussion actually will very much be a practical approach to this, because I think that's often not really discussed, maybe. So, and I know that I feel that there's a real barrier to entry with live electronics. It can be incredibly technical. And I try and take an approach to it that is quite embodied and quite a physical approach, and that borrows so much from the instrumental world. So I'll discuss that today then. So what we're going to look at is design considerations for electronic musical instruments, designing performance systems for improvisation, and a kind of disembodied and a re-embodied approach to that and a process. So to start off, I'll just mention one specific difference between designing traditional, let's say, acoustic instruments to electronic or hybrid instruments. And I use the word hybrid instrument actually because it cannot be separated as a controller or hardware and software and performer, but actually the hybridity of it encompasses a body, hardware and software into something that is a system, and where one cannot be easily replaced actually. So just to highlight a key difference there is that, and certainly how it informs my approach, is with traditional instruments, your body must adapt to that instrument because there are acoustic limitations. Whereas with electronic music instruments, you can literally take the reverse approach, that you can adapt the electronics to individual bodies. And that's something that is really interesting me more and more over the last few years, particularly taking an approach which is to design for an individual body rather than designing a one-size-fits-all or one instrument where you must accommodate that. And the reason I think I'm so drawn to that is because there's so many different ways you can move to make music, and everyone has a different intuitive movement, and it's in the same way that our musical ears are made up of everything that we've ever heard, and that informs our musical intuition. Our movement intuition is made up of every way that we move, the jobs that we've had, or the instruments that we've played. So that means that everyone literally moves and uses their body in a unique way. So I think there's an amazing opportunity to be able to build an instrument that incorporates that and respects that actually more than anything else, rather than you having to move in a particular way where you have to do with acoustic instruments. This is to say that we can adapt this to learn more a bit about how we like to move. So that's kind of, yeah, just giving, I guess, a key difference between those two approaches. And, you know, I'm speaking quite generally about that. There are some limitations, and actually the limitations of the body completely comes back into what I'm doing. So, but generally speaking, I have more freedom than I do have with acoustic instruments. So I have some guiding principles and considerations. So one thing is that I need real-time response and spontaneity for improvised music. And that seems really simple, but it's actually less easy with electronic instruments. You have to design it for that. And it's quite an interesting thing, designing an instrument for improvisation, because you expect, because you're composing as you're designing. But actually, I'd probably argue that when you pick up an instrument and bring that, an acoustic instrument, to an improvisation session, you've already made a compositional choice there as well. You could argue that you can show up in a room and play whatever's there, and I'll agree with you. But so I think having to design an instrument that is capable of a real-time response is harder than it might seem, but it's incredibly important because the moment is gone in an instant. And if I'm typing into a keyboard, I've kind of lost that moment. That's one reason why I use controllers quite a lot. I use something called a game track controller that you'll see in a few minutes, which is a box on the ground that's got strings that come out of it. I actually make use of a lot of games controllers a lot because actually the gaming industry is kind of miles ahead in this area, so I can just borrow from a lot of what they've done and make use of it for musical purposes. So yeah, you'll see me play that instrument or that controller. You make use of that controller in a minute. So another kind of guiding principle is availability of material. So that means there are limitations with acoustic instruments as well, that maybe with a piano there's only so much you can do inside and outside the piano at the same time. So there's certain kinds of limitations that it'll take a little bit of time to transition between the two. But you have a wide range of material available there. One reason why I use voice a lot is because, and you can argue with me on this as well, that I think it's the most versatile musical instrument there is. I think it can produce sounds that nothing else can produce, and I find that deeply fascinating. So that means responding with my voice, then I'm making use of a vaster range of material that might be where I don't have to make all those kind of decisions in advance, let's say. Okay, and then really, really key things. All of these things, I promise, are very important. Performer agency. So all these things are kind of a given in acoustic instruments, and they're harder and they require more thought, I think, in electronic music. So performer agency, where I actually know what I'm doing and I feel confident about that. That is really important, and I have to design an instrument where I have really good control over that. And it doesn't accidentally play. So, you don't want to be holding a guitar and you all of a sudden accidentally play that guitar. That's not going to happen, but actually it happens in electronic music all of the time. And it's funny because I think it's quite exciting that really, I know that there are amazing advances in technology, but I still feel that we are at such an early stage in electronic music. It is so young when you compare it to, hundreds and hundreds of years of the instrumental world. Electronic music is so young, and how we experience that, how we perceive it, how we interact with it, where we want an embodied approach, where we don't want that. Those debates, I think, are at such an early stage, and I think they're really deeply fascinating. So performer agency, really key. On a simple level, it's I need to know what I'm doing, and I'll tell you how I guide myself through that. Another thing is audience reception. So that is where I know what I'm doing, but do the audience know what I'm doing? And that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and actually worrying about, because the reason for that is that if you're thinking about how something is working and you're focusing on the technology, then I don't really think you're experiencing it as a performance at all, but rather a demonstration of technology. And if that happens, I just feel deeply disappointed in myself, not anyone else. So those two things are actually quite carefully linked. That having a good sense of control, when you don't know how things are working, but you know that the performer knows what they're doing, I think it gives you a sense of confidence in that as well, and you can engage with it in a deeper way. So sometimes those things work really closely together, and sometimes they can work in opposition. I'll just explain to give an example of that, how kind of technology can really be a barrier and also be a solution. So technology can be the solution to performer agency, because I've mentioned if I'm typing on a keyboard, I'm doing that. I can do that really at a slow pace. If I'm using a mouse, I can control one thing at a time, because that's what a mouse is designed to do. If I use a controller that can control 6 parameters, and I have a button that can switch to a different 6 parameters, I can control 12 things at once. And that means I have a lot more real-time control. The problem is that then an audience member looks at that and says, I have no idea what's happening. And you'll see that, and you can judge that for yourselves in a minute. So the technology can really give you a lot of affordances and a lot more control, but it can really be a barrier as well if people don't know what they're looking at. So you don't have to be able to play a violin to understand what this gesture means. We just kind of understand what that means because we have hundreds of years of it. Whereas if I'm holding a controller and I do this, maybe you can imagine the sound if I do that. So I can borrow quite a lot from the acoustic world. If I do this, it's going to sound different to me doing this, right? I think that's fair enough. So that's where gesture comes into this. So I've written this at the end, that methods should enable a high degree of performer agency through something called pseudo-direct causality and a high degree of audience reception through audiovisual symbiosis. So that's meaning that what you see and what you hear should be very closely linked. And when you can establish a close relationship between those two things, you can understand it a bit more, you can relax in, and you can kind of engage with it a lot more. So the methods employed for developing these instruments should kind of link into those things. So this pseudo-direct causality, that's a really fancy way of saying something really simple, that it should feel like something has been caused directly, even if it's not caused directly. So we have lots and lots of examples of that. When I turn on the light switch, we can say, we'd all agree that I turned on the light, but I didn't, I pressed a switch and that caused an electrical current to do something else, and I don't know what happens after that. But we can kind of all agree that it feels as though I've done that. And in a lot of controllers, you have much bigger dials and buttons because they give you haptic feedback. There's a certain sense of connection between the energy I've put in and what I'm getting out. So we really like those larger kind of dials because of that. And that's kind of having a sense of directly causing something. So you're not really directly causing it. I'm not really directly causing things, but I'm indirectly doing so, and kind of more pseudo-directly doing so. That it's a very close relationship. There's a very minimal lag there, so it feels very close to I have caused that to occur. And that, again, that both aids performer agency and audience reception. Okay, so I said it would be practical as well. So what are the steps you actually take to design an instrument? So interestingly, I think the design process itself is actually improvised. So that means I can start with an idea of a sound or a movement and try and imagine an instrument from there. And the fun thing about this, I think, is that this actually involves playing an instrument that doesn't exist yet. So it's improvised in lots of ways, that I'm actually trying to play an instrument that I haven't made yet. So that means I can be using a controller and moving with it, and I can be thinking about, well, what should this movement sound like? What does this gesture suggest? Can I borrow this from any other part of the musical world? Or is this something new that I should create? We could say, well, that's cyclical, so it's something that's repeating. And what I'll start to do then as I'm designing an instrument is that there's one piece of it, now it does one thing. And now I'll start to notice what way does my body want to move. And I might find that I'm leaning forward, or I might find that I'm stretching upwards. And then I'll think, okay, well, what do I want to occur when I am moving in that way? So what is the sound that I expect? Or what is the kind of control that I really want to have over that instrument when I move in a different way? So I'm being guided then by how my body wants to move and what my ears want to hear. And then afterwards, I have to figure out how to get that movement, get it into data, and then turn that data into sound somehow. So that's when it becomes a bit more technical, but actually most of the time it's really about movement and gesture. So, you could decide for yourself what this should sound like. And maybe you'll all think something different, and that's actually probably the thing that excites me the most about this, that you will probably think something different, and everyone will move in different ways, and it'll mean something different to everyone individually. Okay, so yeah, this is then definitely thinking about this as being disembodied and then re-embodied. So I think that's my approach to this. So relationships to sound are in part physical. Musical instruments typically require the performer to blow, strum, hit, and bow. This gesture determines the characteristics of the resulting sonic event. So electronic music dissolved the embodied relationship between the musician and the instrument, but it also introduced a broad range of possibilities beyond the limits of the human body, raising questions about the role of gesture in musical performance. So these questions and debates are still very much alive, and they have been since the very, very beginning, since the first concert. These questions were asked, and we still don't have answers to them, I think. So a relationship then, or a re-embodied approach, is not just to have the body as an interface, but a fusion of body, controller, hardware, environment, and software. So what that means is that it's not that I become the instrument, or I become the thing that actually controls it as an interface to a system, but actually how I move my own intuitive movement becomes integral to the system. The controller that I'm using, the data that that produces becomes integral to the system, and how that's interpreted in an environment that I've created or in software also becomes all tied into one in this messy relationship that I haven't quite figured out, but they are all connected. So again, that means that you can't just take one out and I can't remove myself, put someone else in, and it be the same instrument or environment. I think it becomes something new because people move differently. So this is similar in some ways to what Samani has said about when she discussed the lady's glove, which is a glove with modified with sensors. So she said, I think a controller becomes an instrument when the software starts reflecting and adapting the limitations and possibilities of the controller. And your musical thinking and ideas become more a symbiosis between the controller, the software, and the hardware. I used to have much more of a distinction between the hardware, my sounds, the software, and the gestures, a sort of puzzle. Now I realize that my imagination is pretty much molded by the system I use. I don't think as much how will I adapt my ideas to the instrument, but I realize that the instrument has already influenced what I envision. So then it becomes quite a cyclical process. When you've designed something, then all of a sudden that molds how you think about it, which I think is very much the same as if you write on a particular an acoustic instrument. If you write on the piano, your music can sound like it's written on a piano. So it's the same kind of thing. You approach it in that way because it's very much an embodied approach. So I think that's interesting that there's a space between when the controller becomes an actual instrument. So when does that happen? I don't think that's every single time, but I think it's exciting when it does. Okay. I've got a little video to play, but I'm not sure if it will do that. So if it doesn't, I can talk through it instead. Not playing? Okay, sorry.
Your output.
Oh, I'll set it. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. HDD. Thank you. Sorry, 2 seconds. Okay, thank you. We'll try that again. It's getting ready. Got a spinning wheel. I'm getting multiple spinning wheels, so I'll talk through it instead. And you can, this is available on the interwebs, so you can YouTube it if you like. Okay, so I'll tell you what really interests me in this performance is the movement is required to control the electronics, but the gesture is determined by the performer. So I had to tell the performer certain things like, you know, this is how you control certain parts of the electronics. So for example, there's a looping part that in order to clear it, you have to go past a particular threshold with the controller. So he's got gloves on his hands and they're attached to strings that connect to a box on the ground that just reads the position of his hands. So that's on the x-axis, on the y-axis, and on the z-axis. That also means that if you've got those three parameters, you can actually tell the distance between your two hands as well. So you can tell a few more things, but even just independently, the x, y, and z is reading. So there's a threshold at which he has to move beyond in order to have something happen. So that's not a gesture. that's just literally determining the movement that's required to control something. But what I found really interesting was that when he was performing this in one part of the piece, where it's quite, it's a sudden change in dynamic, he actually leaps forward to do this. And I never did this when I was developing it. The problem with this approach, by the way, is that it's really costly because you have to buy all these instruments and then you have to spend a lot of time learning to play them at a really rudimentary level in order to design an electronic instrument that molds off it. But despite all that, it has its benefits, I hope. So when I was playing with this, I never would have moved in that way. And I learned a lot from observing that how he moved with this was so different to how I moved. And so in order to do that, the first time he did it, he jumped across, and then later in the piece, he actually just starts creeping up to that line all the time, and then eventually meets that threshold. So I found that really interesting, the exact same thing, but actually the musical meaning in those two separate events is really quite different. So his body approached it in a really, in two really different ways. So I learned a lot, I think, from that. So this one is a little different again. So I approached this having a little differently, having done the other piece. So the gesture control is actually designed rather than being left up to the performer, but it was designed in consultation with the performer. So that meant that in some sessions, what seemed like an intuitive movement to me, to move in a particular way to cause something to occur, that didn't seem natural to move in that particular way for the performer. So it was very easy for us to rework certain things technically to say, well, it seems like this makes more sense for you to move in this way in order for this to occur. So I found it particularly interesting to learn about that we even have ideas of how movement is related to sound in our own bodies in the first place, and then to note that they are really unique. So when I design an instrument, someone asks, can it do this? And I think, no, I never thought of doing that. And it's the first thing that they thought of. Or they will move with it in a totally different way than I will move with it. And again, it's the first way that they've done that. So it really becomes something that's truly embodied and truly unique. So some of my learning then that I take away from this, everything is always a learning process for me. So never-ending journey. But the idea that I mentioned earlier, that technology can be a solution to performer agency, but a real barrier to audience reception. There's a couple of other instances of that. For example, we all kind of know that our phones have gyroscopes in them. They have sensors, and we can move them around, and that works because we've got maps and things. So if I use a phone on stage, you probably everyone recognizes, oh, it's a phone and it's doing this, and you immediately get past that barrier because you understand that technology already. But if I use a different sensor that is literally the same thing, but it's a better quality one, because a phone is also designed to do other things. Not that we ever do that, like make phone calls or text, but apparently that's what it's designed to do. So I've got another sensor that is designed only to give me this really smooth, lovely data. But if I use that, and you just see my hand moving and there's something stuck to the back of my hand, that becomes a barrier because you don't know what it is. So it's interesting in that case because it's literally the exact same thing, but one you recognize and one you don't. So there's kind of decisions then that have to be made about, it's not about having the best tools and the best instrument, but what actually is going to translate. So they're some of the things that I've learned. So movement and gesture are individual, and we can design for individuals. So sometimes I have to ask people about their height because I've had someone say to me before that, they're 6 foot and I'm 5'7", and the instrument I've designed for them, they said is for someone a lot shorter than them. So I've had to adjust things so it's actually their height. So that's kind of just one tiny example, but it's a simple fix. But it's interesting to take that approach and design for individuals. So this one is probably more piquing my attention a lot lately, that there is space between a performed gesture and sonification, so a space between the musician and the dancer. That the performed gesture is kind of this thing that I mentioned earlier, or this thing, but actually there's a space, and then sonification is where I just move and it takes the data and it interprets it as sound, but I'm actually thinking about movement and not thinking about necessarily about the resulting sound, but it's a sonification of movement as opposed to a performing of an instrument. But actually, and I used to only think about those two things as being in opposition to each other, but now I'm thinking that there's actually a space between those two things that I'm trying to dig into. And I hope I'm doing that in the performance that you'll see now. Okay, so yeah, to be prepared to improvise, decisions need to be made in advance. And then having to decide what decisions that you make. So they're the other kinds of things. And maybe more recently, that pseudo-direct causality could actually be haptic illusion. And that I haven't resolved yet. And I'm kind of throwing it in there as something that I'm still thinking about, that maybe that all I'm doing is creating illusion. And I don't know if that's okay. And that's a really crazy way for me to end this discussion, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave it there and hang and say, I'll let you decide if there's something real and tangible to this, or if it's illusion. My God, I did not intend on ending that way. Okay, I will. Thank you so much. Cool. Nice.